She had everything the world said mattered, and still slept with the lights on. Scarlett Monroe built a billion-dollar empire before her 30th birthday, but the night a quiet IT contractor named Daniel Hayes walked into her building, nothing in her carefully controlled world would ever be the same. Because buried inside her own company was a secret that could destroy everything she'd fought for, and the only person who found it was the one man she almost had arrested. This is a story about power, betrayal, and what happens when a child's drawing becomes the most dangerous piece of evidence in a billion-dollar fraud. If this story pulls you in from the first minute, hit that like button right now and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The thing about Chicago in November was that it didn't ease you into the cold. It just arrived, blunt and indifferent, the way bad news tends to arrive, without warning and without apology. Daniel Hayes felt it the moment he stepped off the blue line at Washington, the wind cutting straight through the gap between his coat collar and the back of his neck. He pulled the collar up, tucked his chin, and kept walking. He had a habit of walking fast, not because he was always late, though sometimes he was, but because movement felt like the only honest response to being alive and broke, in a city that charged you for standing still. His phone read 7:41 a.m. The Monroe Technologies building was 11 blocks north. He had 19 minutes. He thought about Emma. She'd been half asleep when he left, curled under the comforter with one arm hanging off the side of the bed and her hair spread out like she'd been dropped there from a height. He'd stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he needed to, just watching her breathe. She was 7, and she still slept with total abandon. No tension in her small body, no guarded posture, nothing held back. He used to sleep like that once. He was reasonably sure of it. He'd packed her lunch before the alarm went off. Turkey sandwich, the crust cut off because she hated them. Apple slices in a separate container so they wouldn't make the bread soggy. A small bag of crackers she probably wouldn't touch because she'd trade them for whatever her friend Lily brought. He'd written, "Have a good day," on a sticky note and folded it under the sandwich. He wasn't sure she still read them. He still wrote them. Mrs. Carver from 4B had agreed to walk Emma to school again today. Daniel paid her $40 a week, which he couldn't really afford, but the alternatives were worse. Emma liked Mrs. Carver. She said she smelled like cinnamon, and Mrs. Carver seemed genuinely fond of Emma in the way older women sometimes are with quiet, observant children. She called Emma the little philosopher, which Emma found embarrassing and secretly loved. Daniel had been on the contract circuit for 3 years. He was good at his job, genuinely good, not just competent. But the tech job market had a way of rewarding the people who were good at seeming good more than it rewarded the people who were just quietly excellent. He'd had 4 contracts in 30 months. Each one ended for a different stated reason. Budget restructuring, project completion, team consolidation. He'd learned to stop reading between the lines. The result was always the same: pack up your laptop bag, return your badge, collect your final payment, and start over. Monroe Technologies was contract number 5. He knew who Scarlett Monroe was. Everyone in tech knew who she was. You couldn't scroll through an industry newsletter without running into her name. Youngest female founder to take a tech company public on the NASDAQ. Cover of Forbes at 27. The kind of success story that business schools turned into case studies and Reddit threads turned into arguments about whether she deserved it or just got lucky or both. He hadn't given it much thought beyond that. He didn't have the bandwidth for opinions about billionaires. He needed the contract rate, which was solid, and the project sounded like real work. An internal systems audit, infrastructure review, the kind of deep dive technical work he was actually good at. He'd applied on a Tuesday, gotten a call on Thursday, done a technical interview on Friday, and been offered the contract the following Monday. 12 weeks, renewable if the project required it. He'd said yes before the recruiter finished the sentence. The Monroe Technologies building occupied the northeast corner of Walker and Michigan, 42 floors of glass and reinforced steel that caught the morning light in a way that made it look like it was generating its own weather. Daniel had walked past it before without paying attention to it, which felt slightly embarrassing in retrospect. The lobby was enormous and deliberately intimidating. High ceilings, polished concrete floors, 2 security desks staffed by people who looked like they'd been hired specifically for their ability to make visitors feel like they'd shown up to the wrong party. There was a wall of screens running company metrics and news feeds and product announcements in a rolling loop that nobody in the lobby seemed to be watching. Daniel gave his name at the desk, produced his ID, signed 3 separate documents, and was issued a temporary badge that he was told, twice, did not grant access to floors 30 through 42. He nodded both times. A young woman named Priya from HR came down to collect him, made polite small talk in the elevator about the weather and the project timeline, and delivered him to a workstation on the 14th floor that was clean, well-equipped, and completely anonymous. "Orientation's at 9, Priya said. "There are 6 other contractors starting this week, so you'll all go through it together. In the meantime, help yourself to the coffee station. It's down the hall past the glass conference room. And let me know if you need anything." She was gone before he could ask where the bathroom was. He found it on his own. He found the coffee station, too, poured himself a cup, and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the Chicago River while he drank it. The river was dark and fast-moving this time of year, carrying whatever it carried south toward the lake. He watched it for a minute. Then he went back to his desk and started reading the project brief. Yet, the orientation was thorough and, to its credit, honest about what it was. A woman named Diane from legal walked them through the NDA with the kind of steady, unreadable calm that told Daniel she'd given this presentation several hundred times and had long since stopped wondering whether anyone was actually listening. The security protocols were detailed. The data handling requirements were extensive. The confidentiality obligations were, in Diane's words, not suggestions. There were 7 contractors total. Daniel was the only one doing infrastructure work. The others were split between UX research, content operations, and something called product ecosystem mapping, which nobody adequately explained. He paid attention during the parts that mattered and let his mind wander during the parts that didn't. At one point, he found himself thinking about whether Emma's school had a parent volunteer event coming up that he'd forgotten to RSVP to, which was a specific and recurring variety of low-grade anxiety he'd developed sometime around her first day of kindergarten and hadn't fully shaken since. After orientation, he was escorted to meet his direct supervisor, a systems manager named Carl Brewer, who was pleasant enough in a distracted, time-pressed way that Daniel recognized immediately. Carl was a man who had too many things on his plate and had learned to communicate primarily in email subject lines and action items. "The audit scope's in your project folder," Carl said, already looking back at his monitor. "Start with the Q3 data logs. Flag anything that looks irregular. The goal is a clean systems report by end of week 4, but honestly, given the state of some of these legacy systems, I'd be satisfied with a solid draft." "What are you expecting to find?" Daniel asked. Carl shrugged. "Inefficiencies, redundancies, the usual mess you get when a company scales too fast and nobody takes the time to clean up behind them." He paused. "Nothing exciting." "Got it," Daniel said. He was back at his desk by 11 a.m. and started pulling logs. Yeah, the first 3 days were exactly what Carl had described. The usual mess. Monroe Technologies had grown faster than its infrastructure could handle, and the evidence was everywhere. Redundant server instances, deprecated processes that nobody had formally decommissioned, data pipelines that had been patched so many times they barely resembled their original architecture. It was the kind of systemic disorganization that wasn't malicious, just the natural result of a company that had been running full speed for 5 years without stopping to look down at its own foundation. Daniel cataloged it methodically. He was good at this, finding patterns in data structures the way other people found patterns in faces, recognizing what was supposed to be there versus what had quietly stopped belonging. He made notes. He flagged issues. He built a working document that was already twice as long as Carl probably expected. He also began to notice something else. It was small at first, a line item in the Q3 financial data logs that didn't reconcile the way it should, a figure that appeared in one report and didn't carry forward correctly into another. He almost passed it over. It looked like exactly the kind of accounting error you'd expect to find in systems this tangled, a rounding discrepancy maybe, or a data export that hadn't mapped cleanly between platforms. But something made him pull the thread. He told himself it was professional habit, the part of him that couldn't let an unexplained variable sit unresolved. He stayed past 6 that first evening, long enough to make Mrs. Carver text him a gentle reminder that she had a doctor's appointment the next morning and needed him home by 7:15. He sent Emma a voice message on his phone telling her he'd be home soon and that he loved her. She sent back a voice message that was mostly the sound of her eating cereal and then a single word. Okay. He left at 6:52. By the end of his first week, the rounding discrepancy had become something else entirely. He'd pulled transaction logs across 6 quarters, then 9. The pattern was subtle. Whoever had designed it had been careful, rotating the amounts, cycling through different account codes, never hitting the same ledger line twice in a way that would trigger an automatic audit flag. But the pattern was there. Once Daniel could see it, he couldn't unsee it. Money was moving, not in the normal course of business, not through any process he could find documentation for. It was moving in small, regular increments that, individually, looked like noise, and collectively added up to something that turned his stomach. He ran the numbers twice, then 3 times, using a different methodology. The total across 18 months was close to $14 million. He sat back from his screen and looked at the wall for a moment. $14 million, moved in pieces small enough to hide, through a labyrinth of account codes that had clearly been constructed specifically to obscure the movement. This wasn't an accounting error. This wasn't sloppy financial hygiene. This was architecture. Someone had built this. He thought about what to do for a long time. He thought about Emma, about Mrs. Carver, about the 4 previous contracts that had ended for stated reasons that were never really the stated reasons. He thought about the fact that he was a temp, a contractor with a 12-week badge and a workstation that had been wiped clean before he sat down at it. He thought about the fact that none of that changed what he was looking at. He drafted a brief memo, formal, factual, stripped of everything that wasn't directly tied to what the data showed. He attached the relevant log files. He addressed it to Carl Brewer and the head of internal audit, whose name he'd found in the company directory. He read it over 4 times. Then he sent it. He went home. Emma was already asleep. He stood in her doorway and watched her breathe, and he thought, without quite meaning to, that he might have just done something that was going to complicate his life considerably. He was right. The response came the next morning, and it wasn't what he'd expected. Carl called him into a small conference room at 8:30 with an expression that looked carefully neutral in the way that expressions look when they're working hard at it. "Your memo," Carl said, and placed a printed copy on the table between them. "Yes." "The figures you're referencing. I want to make sure I understand what you're saying here." Daniel walked him through it. He'd brought his laptop. He pulled up the logs, showed the pattern, explained the methodology. He kept his voice even. He wasn't trying to be dramatic about it. The data was already dramatic enough on its own. Carl looked at the screen for a long time without speaking. Something moved across his face that Daniel couldn't quite read. "I need to bring this to some people," Carl said finally. "Of course. In the meantime," Carl paused, "keep this close. Don't discuss it with other contractors. Don't talk about it in common areas. We have processes for this kind of thing." "I understand. And Daniel," Carl looked at him directly for the first time, "I'm sure I don't need to say this, but be careful about drawing conclusions you can't prove yet." "I'm not drawing conclusions," Daniel said. "I'm reporting what the data shows." Carl nodded once. He took the printed memo off the table when he left. Daniel went back to his desk and kept working. The first threat arrived 3 days later. It wasn't dramatic. No envelope slipped under a door, no anonymous call in the middle of the night. It was simpler than that, and somehow more unsettling for its simplicity. He came back from lunch to find that a folder of working files had been deleted from his workstation. Not moved, not archived, deleted, including the backup sync that should have preserved them automatically. He checked with IT. The log showed the deletion had originated from his own user credentials during a 40-minute window when he had not been at his desk. He rebuilt the files from memory and from source data that he'd had the foresight to export externally. That same afternoon, 2 senior engineers stopped by his desk separately, within an hour of each other, asking questions that weren't quite questions, observations about his methodology, gentle suggestions that his approach might be overcomplicating the scope. Remarks about how easy it was for someone unfamiliar with the company's specific systems architecture to misread what they were seeing. Both of them were friendly about it. That was the part that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He called Mrs. Carver that evening and asked if she could keep Emma 1 extra hour after school for the rest of the week. Mrs. Carver said that was fine. Emma got on the phone briefly to report that she had drawn a picture of the building Daniel worked in because it was the shiniest building she had ever seen. Daniel told her it was very shiny, yes. "I want to see inside it," Emma said. "Maybe someday," he said. "What?" Emma saw the inside of Monroe Technologies 6 days later, under circumstances Daniel had not anticipated and could not have prevented. He'd been working late, later than he should have, pushing past 9 o'clock on a Friday because he was close to something in the data that he couldn't make himself walk away from. Mrs. Carver had a family obligation she hadn't mentioned until Thursday afternoon. The only solution Daniel could find on short notice was to bring Emma to the office for 2 hours while he finished what he needed to finish, then take her home. Emma was, by temperament, a quietly self-sufficient child. She brought a book and a small sketch pad. She was always drawing, had been since she was old enough to hold a crayon with intent, and she installed herself at the corner of Daniel's workstation with the focused contentment of someone who was fine wherever she was, as long as there were interesting things to look at. And there were interesting things to look at. Emma took in the building the way she took in everything, carefully, deliberately, cataloging details with those dark, steady eyes that sometimes, in certain lights, looked unsettlingly like her mother's. Daniel gave her his spare headphones and his phone with a downloaded movie and told her not to wander. For a while, she didn't. He was deep in a data thread, a sequence of account transfers that pointed more and more insistently toward a specific set of user credentials. When he realized he'd stopped hearing the small ambient sounds Emma made, the quiet humming, the occasional rustle of a page turning, he looked up. Her chair was empty. He found her 11 minutes later, which felt like much longer, in the open corridor near the elevator bank on the same floor. She was standing very still, the way she stood when she was trying not to be noticed, pressed against the wall with her sketch pad clutched against her chest. She looked at him when he appeared, and her expression was the one he'd learned to read as something happened that I don't fully understand. "Em." He kept his voice low and steady. "What are you doing over here?" "I went to get water," she said, "from the little kitchen. You said that was okay." "I did. That's okay." And then I heard people talking in the loud room. She tilted her head toward a set of closed glass doors about 30 feet down the corridor. A conference room, lights still on inside, blinds partially drawn. They weren't being quiet. "What did you hear?" She looked at the closed doors, then back at him. "A lot of numbers," she said, and one man kept saying a name, not a person name, more like a code name. Daniel looked at the conference room. Through the gaps in the blinds, he could make out shapes, at least 3 people, maybe 4, gathered around one end of the table. Late Friday night, lights on, no meeting listed on the public calendar. "Okay," he said. He kept his voice completely even. "Let's go back to the desk." Emma went with him without argument. She had learned, in the way children learn things they're never directly taught, to read the particular quality of her father's calm. The difference between his genuine relaxed calm and the controlled kind he wore when he was managing something. This was the controlled kind. She sat back down and pulled out her sketch pad. She didn't put the headphones back on. When Daniel glanced at her 20 minutes later, she was drawing. He didn't ask her about it until they were on the train home, rattling south through the dark. "The people in that room," he said, "the ones you heard talking." Emma was leaning against his arm, her sketch pad in her lap. "Yes?" "Did you see any of them?" She was quiet for a moment. "When I was walking back, the door opened a little, just for a second." "Did you recognize anyone?" She considered this with the seriousness she brought to questions she thought deserved it. "I've seen one of them before," she said, "in the big picture near the elevator." The big picture near the elevator was a framed company directory display. Photographs and names, floor-specific. Daniel had walked past it every day without paying much attention to it. "Do you remember what he looked like?" he asked. "I drew him," Emma said. She turned the sketch pad toward him. The drawing was what you'd expect from a 7-year-old. Simplified, proportions slightly off, more impression than portrait. But there was something in it, a specific quality she'd caught. The high forehead, the particular set of the jaw, the way the subject apparently stood with his shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted. Daniel looked at it for a long time. "Who else was there?" he asked. She turned to the next page. 2 more drawings. Quicker, less detailed, but enough. "There was a door in the room," Emma added. "Not the main door, a side door. And one man came in through that door. He had a key. The restricted access corridor. The one that connected to the executive suite." Daniel stared at the drawings on the train, at the dark city moving past the windows, at his daughter's calm face. "You did good, Em," he said. She shrugged, the way she shrugged when she thought praise was being applied in the wrong place. "I just drew what I saw," she said. "That's what you're supposed to do." The second week ended on a Friday, and by Saturday morning, Daniel Hayes had a fairly clear picture of what he was dealing with, and a fairly clear understanding of how much trouble that picture represented. He didn't sleep well. He lay in the dark while Emma slept across the hall, and he thought through the options the way he thought through data problems, systematically, eliminating the impossible, working toward whatever remained. Reporting it internally had already produced deleted files and veiled warnings. Taking it externally, to regulators, to law enforcement, was an option, but one that would take time he wasn't sure he had, and would almost certainly cost him the contract before anything moved. The position he was in, contractor, no institutional standing, no internal allies, no protection, was not a position from which he could easily fight back. What he had was evidence, incomplete evidence, but evidence. And he had Emma's drawings, which were not nothing. He got up at 6 and made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window and watched the street below. A woman walked a dog. A delivery van double parked. The ordinary city, doing its ordinary Saturday things. He thought about Scarlett Monroe. He'd seen her once, from a distance, crossing the lobby on Wednesday afternoon, moving fast with 2 people hustling to keep pace, the particular kind of forward momentum that powerful people carry around them like weather. She hadn't looked his way. There was no reason she would. She was 30 years old and ran a company worth several $billion. She had almost certainly not become that person by being naive. She had also, from everything he'd read and everything he'd observed in a week inside her organization, surrounded herself with people she trusted, a tight, senior inner circle who had been with her from early days. One of those people, or more than one, was stealing from her. The question was whether she knew. He was fairly certain she didn't. Not because powerful people couldn't be corrupt, they clearly could, but because what he'd found in the data bore the signature of concealment, someone hiding something from oversight, including the oversight at the very top. He refilled his coffee. He didn't have access to Scarlett Monroe. He didn't have a path to her that didn't run through the same organizational structure that was already trying to push him out. He didn't have allies on the inside, and he didn't have time to build them. What he had was 12 weeks on a contract, a folder of data he'd backed up to 3 separate secure locations, and a 7-year-old sketchpad. He also had one thing he'd learned from years of working in systems built by people who thought they were being careful. There was always something they forgot to hide. He was going to find it. He set his coffee down and opened his laptop. By Sunday evening, he'd found it. Not a smoking gun. Not yet. But a specific pattern of access timestamps that didn't align with any authorized activity log. A user credential that appeared in the financial data threads, and also, in a completely separate system he'd been reviewing for a different part of the audit, in the Executive Communications Archive. A credential that pointed unmistakably to a specific individual. The Chief Financial Officer. His name was Martin Reeves. He'd been with Scarlett since the company's 2nd year. He had a corner office on the 38th floor and a photograph on the company website that showed him standing beside Scarlett at a press event, both of them smiling, her hand briefly on his arm in that way that meant this is someone I trust. Daniel stared at the name on his screen. He saved the file. Then he saved it again to a different location. He went to check on Emma. She was awake, sitting on her bedroom floor, drawing again. "What are you working on?" he asked. She held up the sketchpad. She'd added details to the drawings from the other night. Background elements, the shape of the room, the position of the side door. She'd also added a small figure in one corner of the frame that he hadn't noticed she'd seen. "Who's that one?" he asked. She looked at the drawing. "I don't know his name," she said. But he was the most important one. He was the one the other people were listening to. The figure was positioned at the head of the table. High forehead, squared shoulders, chin slightly lifted. Daniel sat down on the floor next to his daughter. "Emma," he said carefully, "I need you to keep these drawings somewhere safe." She looked at him, then at the drawings, then back at him. "Are they important?" she asked. "They might be," he said. She considered this with complete seriousness. Then she closed the sketchpad, stood up, and put it inside the locked box where she kept her most valued things: the photograph of her mother, the friendship bracelet from Lily, the small glass bird she'd found on a beach 2 summers ago. She clicked the lock. "Safe," she said. Daniel looked at his daughter. Her small, self-possessed face, her absolute unflappable calm, and felt, not for the first time, that she was considerably more prepared for the world than he was. "Thank you, Em," he said. She shrugged. "That's what you're supposed to do," she said again, and went back to drawing something new. Outside, the Chicago cold pressed against the windows. The city hummed and rattled and pushed forward, the way it always did, indifferent to the small lives playing out inside it. Daniel sat on his daughter's bedroom floor for another minute, listening to the scratch of her pencil, feeling the particular weight of what was coming settle into him. Not fear exactly, but the sober recognition of a man who has found the edge of something large and knows, without wanting to, that he's already past the point where he can pretend he didn't see it. He was going back on Monday, and everything was about to get much harder. Monday came the way Mondays always came after weekends spent dreading them, too fast and without mercy. Daniel was at his desk by 7:40, earlier than anyone else on the 14th floor, the overhead lights still on their automatic dim setting, the coffee station not yet restocked. He made do with what was left in the carafe from Friday, stale, burnt at the bottom, the kind of coffee that told you it had been waiting for someone to notice it. He drank it anyway. He'd spent Sunday night reorganizing everything he had. The financial log exports were backed up in 3 places: a personal encrypted drive he kept in his coat pocket, a secure cloud account he'd set up years ago under an email address that had no connection to his professional identity, and a compressed archive he'd emailed to himself at that same address with a subject line that read, "Emma School Photos Fall." The kind of thing that looked at a glance like exactly what it claimed to be. The data files were renamed accordingly. He wasn't proud of the paranoia. He also wasn't going to apologize for it. What he needed now was something he didn't yet have: a clear, traceable line from Martin Reeves to the money. The credential overlap he'd found Sunday was suggestive, not conclusive. A good defense attorney, and Reeves would have a very good defense attorney, would tear it apart in 20 minutes. What Daniel needed was a transaction record that Reeves had touched directly, not a subordinate's credentials, not an automated process running under his authorization. Reeves himself, moving money, at a specific time and date that could be matched against an access log. He pulled up the Executive Communications Archive. He wasn't supposed to be in it. His audit scope technically covered infrastructure and financial data systems, not communications. But the systems were old enough and interconnected enough that with the right sequence of queries, he could pull metadata from the Communications Archive without technically accessing message content, just routing data, timestamps, user activity logs. The kind of thing that showed who was where in the system and when without showing what they said. He built the query carefully. Then he ran it. The results came back in 40 seconds. On the night of September 14th, the same night the largest single transfer in his data set had occurred, moving just under $800,000 through 4 shell account codes before dispersing into what looked like legitimate vendor payments. Martin Reeves had been active in the financial management system for 2 hours and 17 minutes, starting at 11:43 p.m. 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday. Daniel wrote the timestamp down on a physical notepad. Old habit. He underlined it twice. Then he heard the elevator open behind him, and he closed the query window with a reflex that surprised him with its speed. It was just a woman from the UX team arriving early, earbuds in, not looking at him. She went to her desk on the far side of the floor without acknowledging his existence. He exhaled slowly and turned back to his screen. He had what he needed. Not everything. Not yet. But enough to make the case that this required someone with actual authority to act on it. The problem was still the same problem it had been on Friday. He had no path to that authority that wasn't already compromised. He thought about it for most of that morning. He thought about it through a status meeting with Carl that was brief and unremarkable, through a lunch he ate at his desk because he didn't want to be away from his workstation longer than necessary, through 2 hours of legitimate audit work he kept doing because stopping would have been more conspicuous than continuing. He was still thinking about it at 2:15 in the afternoon when Scarlett Monroe walked onto the 14th floor. Well, he almost missed her. He'd been staring at a data visualization he'd built, a timeline of the transfers mapped against access logs, and he registered the shift in the floor's atmosphere before he registered the cause. The quality of the background noise changed. People sat up slightly. Conversations dropped to a more professional register. He looked up. She was moving through the floor at the same pace he'd seen in the lobby, purposeful, unhurried in the way that people are unhurried when they know their time is more valuable than anyone else's in the room. She was with two people, a woman with a tablet who was clearly her assistant, and a man Daniel didn't recognize in a gray suit who was clearly trying to seem like he wasn't struggling to keep up. She was looking at something the assistant was showing her on the tablet. She wasn't looking at the floor, at the contractors, at the rows of workstations or the people sitting at them. Then she looked up. Not at Daniel, specifically. Not at first. She was doing the thing powerful people do when they walk through a space they own, a sweep, a read, absorbing the room without appearing to. But her sweep stopped. At him. He wasn't sure why. He wasn't doing anything unusual. Sitting at his desk, looking up from his screen like several other people on the floor were at that moment. But something made her eyes stop on him for a second longer than they'd stopped on anyone else. And in that second, he had the distinct and uncomfortable feeling of being assessed by someone who was very good at it. Then she looked away and kept walking, already back in conversation with the assistant. She turned the corner and was gone. Daniel realized he'd been holding his breath slightly. He let it out. The floor's atmosphere resumed its normal pitch. He looked back at his screen. He thought, she doesn't know. Not because of anything she'd done or said. She hadn't done or said anything. She'd just looked at him for a moment. But there was something in that look that didn't carry the particular quality of someone who was in on it. He couldn't have explained it to anyone. It was the kind of judgment you made on incomplete information and knew was incomplete and made anyway, because sometimes that was the only kind of judgment available. He thought, I need to find a way to talk to her. He also thought, that is going to be extremely difficult. Well, he was right about the difficulty. The organizational architecture around Scarlett Monroe was not accidental. Every path to her ran through people who had reasons, professional, personal, possibly criminal, to keep him away from her. Carl Brewer wasn't in on it. Daniel was reasonably confident of that. Carl was a middle manager who had too much to manage and too little visibility into what was happening above his level. But Carl also couldn't get Daniel a meeting with the CEO. That wasn't how the structure worked. He needed a different approach. He spent Tuesday documenting everything he had in a format that could be handed to someone and understood without narration. A formal report with sources cited, methodology explained, findings stated in plain language. He wrote it the way he'd learned to write technical documentation, as if the reader was intelligent but had no prior context, and as if he himself would not be available to explain it. He was halfway through that process when the second thing happened. He came back from a bathroom break to find that his monitor had been angled, slightly, maybe 10 degrees, in a way that wasn't how he'd left it. It was the kind of thing that might not mean anything. It was also the kind of thing that, in context, meant someone had been at his workstation. He checked his files. Everything appeared intact. He checked his export history. Clean. But the monitor had been moved. That evening, he told Mrs. Carver he might need her to take Emma for a full day that weekend. Mrs. Carver said that was fine. She asked, in the careful way she had of asking things she sensed were adjacent to something she shouldn't press on, if everything was all right. Working through something, Daniel said. The little philosopher asked me today, Mrs. Carver said, whether her drawings could ever be evidence. Daniel was quiet for a moment. What did you tell her? I said that depended on what they showed. A pause. She seemed satisfied with that. Wednesday was when things started moving faster than he could manage. He arrived to find a different badge waiting for him at the security desk. A replacement, he was told, because the system had flagged his existing one for a routine reset. Standard procedure. He was given the new badge and directed to IT on the third floor for a credentials update. On the third floor, a tech he didn't recognize walked him through the update with the slightly too casual manner of someone who was paying more attention than they were showing. The process took 12 minutes. Daniel sat through it with a stillness he had to consciously maintain, aware that anything on his workstation that hadn't been externally backed up was potentially visible to someone during those 12 minutes. He'd backed up everything. He reminded himself of that. When he got back to his desk, the data visualization he'd built, the timeline, the transfer map, was gone from his local drive. Just that file. Nothing else. He rebuilt it from source data. It took him 4 hours. He did it without speaking to anyone and without changing his expression, which was the only thing he had control over at that point. At 4:30, Carl stopped by his desk with the apologetic bearing of a man delivering news he was uncomfortable with. I'm getting some questions from upstairs, Carl said, his voice lowered, about the scope of your audit work. What kind of questions? Whether your methodology is staying within the defined parameters of the project. Carl picked up a pen from the desk, turned it over once, put it back down. Some concerns that you might be pulling data outside your authorized scope. Daniel looked at him steadily. My work has been within scope. I know. I think I know that. But the questions are coming from a level above me, Daniel, and I need to... Carl stopped, started again. I'm being asked to put together a competency review. Not a termination, not anything formal. Just a... review. I'm sorry, I don't love this. Who's asking for it? Carl's expression shifted briefly into something that might have been discomfort. It came down through HR. I don't know who originated it. Daniel nodded. He kept his face neutral. Okay. I want you to know I don't think... It's fine, Carl. It wasn't fine. When is the review? Friday. That gave him 2 days. He called in a favor that night, a contact he'd worked with 3 years ago, a woman named Jasmine who now did compliance consulting for mid-size financial firms and had, at various points in her career, navigated corporate fraud investigations from the inside. He'd helped her once with a data problem she couldn't solve. She owed him. He texted her at 8 p.m. Need to talk. Sensitive. She called him at 8:14. He gave her the broad outline. No names yet, no company name, just the shape of what he'd found and the shape of what was being done to him in response. Jasmine was quiet for a moment after he finished. You documented the retaliation? As much as I could. The file deletions, the badge situation, the competency review timeline. That's something. She paused. The problem is you're a contractor. You don't have whistleblower protections the way a direct employee might. I know. Which means if they terminate the contract before you can get the evidence in front of someone with authority to act on it, you're just a former contractor with a story. I know, he said again. So your window is narrow. Very, she exhaled. Who owns the company? Not operationally. Who actually has the authority to act on something like this without it getting buried? The CEO, she's also the founder. Does she know? No, I'm almost certain she doesn't. Then you need to get to her directly. Not through channels, directly. Jasmine's voice was flat, practical. The voice of someone who had seen what happened when people tried to do things the right way inside organizations that had decided they didn't want things done the right way. That's not easy. No, Daniel said. But it's the only play you've got. After the call, he stood in the kitchen for a while. Emma had been asleep for an hour. The apartment was quiet in the specific way apartments were quiet when a child was sleeping in them. Not empty quiet, but occupied quiet, held quiet. He thought about what getting to Scarlett Monroe directly actually meant. He was a contractor on the 14th floor. She was the CEO on the 40th. The organizational distance between them wasn't just geographic. It was structural. and the structure was currently being staffed by people who wanted him gone. He had 2 days. He thought about that for a long time. Then he opened his laptop and started doing what he did best, looking for a pattern he hadn't seen yet. The pattern he found, at 11:40 p.m. on a Wednesday, was a scheduled all-hands briefing on Thursday morning. Monthly meeting, 7th floor atrium, attendance mandatory for all permanent staff, and, according to the internal calendar he'd been given access to as part of the project, strongly encouraged for all contractors on active projects. Scarlett Monroe opened every monthly all-hands herself. She'd been doing it since the company's 3rd year. He'd read about it in a profile piece he pulled up that night. She'd made a point of it, the direct address, no intermediaries. She stood up and spoke to the whole company and then took unfiltered questions for 20 minutes. He read the profile 3 times. He was going to be in that room tomorrow morning. He wasn't going to get 20 minutes with her. He probably wasn't going to get 2 minutes. But he had a report. 12 pages, clean, sourced, clear, printed and folded in his jacket pocket, and he had whatever fragment of an opportunity presented itself, and he had the specific quality of stubbornness that develops in people who have been told, repeatedly and by circumstances, that they are in a position from which they cannot win. He'd been told that before. He went to bed at midnight. He set 2 alarms, which he always did, because missing his alarm meant Emma missed school. And Emma missing school meant the day started in a particular kind of disarray that took hours to recover from. He lay in the dark and thought about the timestamp he'd written down. 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday. Martin Reeves in the system at midnight, moving money in pieces too small to trigger flags, through account codes he'd spent months constructing for exactly this purpose. The thing about careful people, Daniel had always found, was that their carefulness had a shape, a signature. The very precision of their concealment left a pattern, because patterns were unavoidable. The brain, trying to be random, kept pulling towards structure, kept returning to the same intervals, the same methods, the same instinct to control. Reeves had been careful. He'd been careful for a long time, and he'd gotten comfortable. And comfort was the thing that undid careful people more reliably than anything else. He'd missed something. Daniel was going to find it tomorrow before the all-hands meeting, and he was going to walk into that atrium with a report worth handing to the woman who owned this company and trusting her to do something with it. Whether she would was a different question, whether she was capable of it, of turning against the person she'd trusted longest, the person who'd been at her side since the beginning, on the strength of evidence handed to her by a contractor she'd never spoken to. That was a question Daniel couldn't answer yet. He was going to have to trust her. He lay in the dark, thinking about trust. What it cost, what it was worth, the particular difficulty of extending it towards someone you had no reason to believe in except the absence of evidence that they were like all the others. The radiator ticked. Emma slept across the hall. He was still awake at 1 a.m., but he was not, for the first time in a week, afraid. He was something else, past fear, into the place on the other side of it, where things got quieter and clearer, and you just dealt with what was in front of you. Thursday was coming. He would be ready. He found it at 6:12 Thursday morning. Daniel had been at his desk since 5:45, the floor completely empty around him, the city outside still doing its slow gray transition from night to early morning. He'd been running a cross-reference he hadn't tried before, matching Reeves's system access timestamps, not against the financial transfer logs, which he'd already mapped, but against the building's physical access records, entry and exit times, badge swipes on restricted doors. It was the kind of thing that required access to 2 separate systems simultaneously, and the only reason he could do it was that both systems were part of the infrastructure audit scope, and he'd been given read credentials for both in his first week. Nobody had thought to revoke those credentials yet, or nobody had gotten around to it. Either way, he had a narrow window and he used it. What he found was this. On 7 separate occasions over the past 18 months, Martin Reeves had badged into the restricted executive data center on the 39th floor at times when the financial transfer activity was occurring. Not near those times, not within an hour of those times. During. The badge swipes and the transaction timestamps overlapped with a precision that couldn't be explained by coincidence and couldn't be explained by anything except the same person doing both things in the same place. The 39th floor data center was where the financial management servers were physically housed, where someone with the right physical access and the right credentials could make changes to transaction records after the fact, could move money, and then adjust the audit trail to make the movement look authorized. Daniel printed the cross-reference. He added it to the report, updated the summary page, reprinted that. 12 pages became 15. He folded them, put them in his inside jacket pocket, and sat back. It was 6:28. The all-hands meeting started at 9. He had 2 hours and 32 minutes. He made coffee. The good kind, from the restocked station. He drank it standing at the windows, watching Chicago wake up below him, and he thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that whatever happened today was going to be determined by factors he couldn't fully control, and that the only thing in his power was to walk into it prepared. He was prepared. He went back to his desk and kept working. What? The 7th floor atrium could hold 300 people. By 8:55, it was close to full. Rows of chairs facing a raised platform at the north end, people standing along the walls, the low ambient noise of a large group that hadn't quite settled yet. Daniel had come down early enough to get a position along the right side aisle, 8 rows back from the platform, close enough to see faces clearly without being conspicuous. He watched people file in around him. He recognized a few faces from the 14th floor. He recognized Carl Brewer near the back, standing with 2 other managers, coffee cup in hand, looking like a man who'd rather be somewhere else. He recognized, with a small tightening in his chest, one of the senior engineers who'd stopped by his desk with careful non-questions the week before. The engineer was laughing at something, relaxed, completely at ease. At 8:59, the room's quality of attention shifted the way it had on the 14th floor 2 days ago. Scarlett Monroe walked in from the side entrance. She was in a dark blazer and gray slacks, no lanyard, no badge. She was the only person in the building who didn't need one. She walked to the platform without any preamble and stood at the microphone with the particular ease of someone who had done this enough times to stop thinking about the mechanics of it. "Good morning," she said. The room answered her back. She spoke for 20 minutes. He listened to some of it and used the rest of the time to watch her eat. Not in a speculative way, but in the way he watched systems, looking for what was real versus what was performed. She was direct. She moved between topics without the padded transitions that people used when they were managing their audience. When she addressed a quarter that had underperformed in one metric, she said so plainly and said what she thought needed to change, and she didn't soften it into language that meant something different. There was one moment she was talking about a product delay, a team that had been under pressure for months, when something in her expression shifted, a brief tightening around the eyes, something that looked like actual concern, not performed concern. He thought, she built this. It's real to her. And then he thought, which means what they've been doing to it is real to her too. She just doesn't know it yet. The Q&A was 20 minutes. Hands went up across the room, and she called on people without apparent pattern, answered questions with varying degrees of detail, pushed back twice on questions she thought were missing the point. She was good at it. She'd clearly always been good at it. He raised his hand once. She didn't call on him. He lowered it. The meeting ended at 9:42. People began moving toward the exits in clusters, the room's noise level jumping back up. He didn't move right away. He watched her step down from the platform and immediately get absorbed into a cluster of people. The assistant, 2 executives, a woman in a red blazer who was talking fast and gesturing with a folder. He had about 90 seconds before she was through the side exit and gone. He moved. He came around the outside of the row, angled toward the platform, moved quickly without running, reached the edge of the cluster as she was already starting to turn toward the exit. "Ms. Monroe!" She turned. The people around her turned. Her assistant's hand came up slightly, the automatic positioning of someone who managed access and knew an unauthorized approach when they saw one. Scarlett Monroe looked at him. Her expression was not warm. It was not hostile either. It was the expression of someone who had been interrupted and was deciding in real time how much of her attention the interruption deserved. "I'm sorry to do this here," Daniel said. He kept his voice level, low enough that it wasn't carrying to the whole room. "My name is Daniel Hayes. I'm on the infrastructure audit team, 14th floor. I have something you need to see, directly, not through anyone else. A beat of silence. "Send it through the appropriate channels," the assistant said. "Ms. Monroe's calendar is—" "The appropriate channels are the problem," Daniel said. He was looking at Scarlett, not at the assistant. "I found something in your financial systems. I reported it through those channels 2 weeks ago. Since then, I've had files deleted, credentials reset, and a competency review scheduled for tomorrow morning. I'm going to be removed before anyone with authority to act on this sees it." Another beat, longer. Scarlett Monroe looked at him with an attention that was different from the sweep she'd done across the atrium. This was focused. Reading. "What did you find?" she asked. $14 million moved out of the company through shell accounts over 18 months. I know who did it. I have the documentation." He reached into his jacket and held out the folded report. 15 pages. "Please read it before tomorrow." She didn't take it immediately. She was still looking at his face with that focused reading quality, and he had the distinct sense that she was not deciding whether to believe the data. She hadn't seen the data yet, but deciding whether to believe him. Her assistant reached for the report. Scarlett put a hand out briefly, stopping her. She took it herself. "My office," she said. 4 o'clock. Then she was through the exit, and the cluster of people moved with her, and Daniel was standing at the edge of the empty platform with his heart beating considerably faster than he'd allowed himself to notice in the moment. He had until 4 o'clock. What happened between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. on that Thursday was a study in how quickly an organization could move when the right people inside it decided something needed to move. Daniel didn't know this at the time. He was on the 14th floor doing the work he was supposed to be doing, aware that he was probably being watched more carefully than usual, and unwilling to give anyone watching a reason to act before his 4 o'clock window. He worked methodically. He documented. He did not look at the clock more than was reasonable. What he didn't know was that Scarlett Monroe had read the first 4 pages of his report before her 10:30 meeting, and by 11 had cleared her afternoon and handed the report to a woman named Vera Halston, her personal legal counsel, who was not part of the Monroe Technologies executive structure and reported exclusively to Scarlett, with instructions to verify independently. Vera had spent the next 3 hours doing exactly that. She was very good at what she did, and she had access that Daniel didn't, and by the time Daniel was riding the elevator to the 40th floor at 3:57, Vera Halston had confirmed enough of what the report described to make the 4 o'clock meeting a different kind of meeting than it might have been otherwise. The 40th floor was different from the 14th floor in the way that things were different when they'd been designed to say something. Clean lines, quiet. The particular atmosphere of a space that didn't have to prove anything because the proof was already in the address. The assistant, her name was Claire, he learned, met him at the elevator and walked him to a conference room adjacent to Scarlett's main office. Not the main office itself. The conference room. He sat down and waited. Scarlett came in 7 minutes later, alone. No assistant, no legal counsel, though he suspected Vera Halston was somewhere nearby. She sat down across the table and put his report on the table between them, the pages marked in several places with small handwritten notes he couldn't read from his angle. She looked at him. "You've been here for 2 weeks, she said. "Yes." "You found this in the first week." "The initial discrepancy? Yes. I spent the second week verifying and building the full picture." She looked at the report, then back at him. "Walk me through it." He did. All of it. The original anomaly, the methodology he'd used to trace it, the shell account architecture, the access log cross-reference, the badge swipe correlation with the physical data center. He talked for 20 minutes without interruption, and she listened the way she'd looked at him earlier, with complete attention, without performing attentiveness, just actually focused on what he was saying in the way that some people never managed regardless of how hard they tried. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You said the credentials pointed to a specific individual," she said. "The report says CFO. Are you confident in that?" "Yes." Something moved across her face. He watched it happen, a slight compression, a brief going inward. She'd known Martin Reeves for 8 years. He'd been at her side through 2 funding rounds and an IPO and a proxy fight she'd nearly lost. Whatever she'd built with this company, she'd built with him standing beside her. "My legal counsel has been verifying since this morning," she said. "She concurs with your core findings. There are additional details she's identified that you didn't have access to. The picture is probably worse than what I found. It's worse, she said flatly, by approximately $9 million, running back further than you could see from your access level. He absorbed that. $23 million, at minimum, moved over years, carefully, by someone who had sat at every major table in this company's growth and used every piece of information those tables gave him. You took a significant risk bringing this to me the way you did, Scarlett said. I didn't have another way to reach you. You could have gone to regulators, law enforcement. I still can, he said. I wasn't trying to protect the company specifically. I was trying to make sure the evidence reached someone who could act on it before I was removed. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. Are you always this direct? More or less. It's gotten me into trouble before. I expect it has. She stood, moved to the window. Chicago below them, the same city and the same cold, looking different from 40 floors up. The competency review scheduled for tomorrow. It was requested by Martin Reeves, routed through HR, so it didn't appear to originate with him. I suspected something like that. She turned back from the window. I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Okay. Is there anything in your process that could be challenged? Any point where you went beyond your authorized access in a way that could undermine the evidence? He thought about it honestly before he answered. The Communications Archive metadata. I pulled activity logs without accessing message content, but the scope of my authorization was technically limited to financial and infrastructure systems. He paused. Everything else was within my explicit authorization, and the communications metadata was only confirmatory. The core case stands entirely on the financial data and physical access records. She nodded slowly. She was thinking through something. He could see it. I'm going to need you to stay available tonight, she said. Vera will have follow-up questions. I want you in this building tomorrow morning, not on the 14th floor. The competency review will not be happening, Scarlett said. Her voice on those 4 words was quiet and final, the voice of someone who was done being managed without knowing it. He left the 40th floor at 5:20. Claire walked him back to the elevator without conversation. He rode down alone, watching the floor numbers drop, and he stood in the lobby for a moment before going out into the cold, processing the specific, disorienting sensation of having done the thing he'd set out to do. It wasn't relief. It was something smaller and less clean than relief. The situation wasn't resolved. It was in motion, which was different. Things in motion could still go wrong. He called Mrs. Carver. He was going to be late. Could she stay with Emma through dinner? Mrs. Carver said yes. Emma, he was told, had been drawing all afternoon and had asked 3 separate times whether her drawings were still safe, which Mrs. Carver found charming and which Daniel found, in his current state, almost unbearably significant. Tell her yes, he said. Tell her they're safe. He came back at 7:30. Emma was at the kitchen table finishing homework, multiplication tables, which she found tedious and wasn't bothering to hide her opinion about. She looked up when he came in with the expression she used when she was deciding whether something was worth commenting on. You look weird, she said. Thanks, Em. Not bad weird, just like you've been running, even though you're not sweaty. He hung up his coat. He sat down at the table across from her. She watched him with those steady, dark eyes. I talked to someone important today, he said, about the work thing. She considered this. Did it help? I think so. I don't know yet. She nodded as if this was an acceptable level of uncertainty and went back to her multiplication tables. He watched her work through a row of problems, her pencil moving with the particular deliberateness she brought to things she wasn't entirely sure of. The drawings, he said. The ones in your box. I might need to show them to some people. She put her pencil down. She thought about it the way she thought about things that she understood were bigger than they were being described. The important people? Yes. Will it get you in trouble if I say no? He looked at his daughter, 7 years old, doing homework at a kitchen table in a 2-bedroom apartment in Chicago, asking whether her refusal would cost him something. No, he said. It's your decision. The drawings are yours. She picked her pencil back up. She finished the row she was on. Then she said, without looking up, They can use them. He didn't say anything for a moment. You sure? I drew what I saw, she said. That's what you're supposed to do. She glanced at him briefly. And then you're supposed to let people who need to see it see it. He sat at the kitchen table with his daughter while she finished her homework, and he thought that whatever happened next, he'd had one extraordinary piece of luck in his life, and it was sitting across from him doing multiplication tables. The call from Vera Halston came at 9:15 that evening. It lasted 40 minutes. She was methodical, careful, precise. She asked him questions he'd expected and several he hadn't, and he answered all of them as accurately as he could. By the end, she had confirmed that the core evidence chain was solid and that the communications metadata issue, while technically irregular, was unlikely to undermine the case given the weight of everything else. Tomorrow morning, Vera said, 9 a.m. We'll need you in the building. I'll be there. Ms. Monroe wanted me to tell you, a brief pause. She wanted me to tell you that she understands what this cost you to pursue. She doesn't say things like that often. He didn't know what to do with that exactly. Okay, he said. 9 a.m., Vera said again, and ended the call. He sat on the couch in the quiet apartment. Emma was asleep. The city outside was doing its nighttime thing, distant traffic, the occasional siren, the low ambient hum of 3 million people living in close proximity and mostly managing not to kill each other. He thought about Martin Reeves, what it took to do what he'd done, to sit across a table from someone who trusted you for years and smile and advise and build and all the while be hollowing them out from the inside. He tried to understand it and couldn't quite reach it. Some things you couldn't reach. You just had to deal with the evidence of them. He went to bed at 10:30. He lay in the dark for a while, longer than he meant to. The events of the day ran through him in no particular order. The cross-reference at 6 a.m., the atrium, Scarlett Monroe's face when she looked at the report, the conference room on the 40th floor, Emma saying they can use them without looking up from her homework. He thought, tomorrow is going to be the worst day yet. He thought, I'm going to go through it anyway. He fell asleep somewhere around midnight without noticing the exact moment it happened. In the locked box on Emma's shelf, 3 drawings waited in the dark, patient and exact and completely without agenda. The way evidence always was, indifferent to what people decided to do with it, just holding its shape, waiting to be seen. He was in the building by 8:40, not the 14th floor. Claire met him in the lobby with a temporary pass that accessed the executive elevator bank, a different physical key than the one he'd been using for 2 weeks. Thicker plastic, different color. The kind of small material detail that communicates a shift in standing even when nobody says it out loud. He clipped it to his jacket pocket and followed her up. The 40th floor had a different energy than it had carried yesterday afternoon. Even at this hour, something was running at a different frequency. Claire moved faster. The 2 people he passed in the hallway had the compressed, forward-tilted posture of people who'd received instructions and were executing them. Nobody made eye contact with him, not out of hostility, but out of focus. Vera Halston was already in the conference room when he arrived. She was in her late 50s, compact, gray-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where things went wrong and had learned not to spend energy on motion that didn't serve a purpose. She had a laptop open, 2 legal pads covered in handwriting, and a coffee she'd barely touched. Sit down, she said, and pointed at the chair across from her without looking up. I want to run through the evidence sequence one more time before 9. He sat. How many times have you run through it already? 4. She looked up briefly. You look like you slept. More than expected. Good. You'll need it. She turned one of the legal pads toward him. I want to confirm the timestamp chain on the physical access records. Walk me through the September 14th entry one more time. He walked her through it. She listened without interruption, cross-referencing against her notes, asking 2 pointed questions at the end that told him she'd found something he hadn't, or had confirmed something from a direction he couldn't access. There's a camera, she said, on the 39th floor data center corridor. It's on a separate security system from the main building cameras, installed 3 years ago as part of a server room upgrade and never fully integrated into the main security infrastructure. Our IT security director found it last night. She paused. The footage from September 14th is intact. Daniel looked at her. You have him on camera. We have someone on camera entering the data center at 11:51 p.m. and exiting at 1:17 a.m. She held his gaze. The footage quality is adequate for identification. The room was quiet for a moment. He didn't know about the camera, Daniel said. He recommended the server room upgrade that funded its installation, Vera said. He never followed up on whether the camera had been integrated into the monitoring system. Presumably he checked, saw it wasn't in the main feed, and assumed it wasn't recording. A brief pause. It records to a local drive. Air-gapped. 360-day retention. Daniel exhaled slowly. That's enough. More than enough. Combined with your financial evidence and the access log cross-reference, the documentation is comprehensive. She pulled the legal pad back and closed her laptop. Scarlett will be here in 10 minutes. The board has been notified. 5 members are joining by secure video link. Martin Reeves has been asked to attend what he believes is an emergency budget review. She looked at Daniel directly. He doesn't know what this meeting actually is. Where are his accomplices? The 2 individuals your daughter's drawings identified, pending confirmation on one of them, have been placed on administrative hold as of this morning. Access suspended. They've been told it's a systems security precaution. Vera allowed herself a small, precise expression that wasn't quite a smile, which is technically accurate. Scarlett arrived at 8:58. She came in alone, sat at the head of the table, and took in Daniel and Vera with a single look that appeared to inventory the room completely. She had the bearing of someone who had been up since before the sun and was running on something that wasn't sleep but was holding well enough. There were very slight shadows under her eyes that she hadn't attempted to conceal. She looked at Daniel. How are you? It was a direct question, not a formality, and it caught him slightly off guard. Ready, he said. Good. She turned to Vera. Where are we? Vera walked her through the overnight findings, the camera footage, the confirmation of the evidence chain, the board members on standby. Scarlett listened with her hands flat on the table, not moving. When Vera mentioned the camera footage, something shifted in Scarlett's jaw. A brief tightening, gone almost immediately, but there. Have you seen it? Scarlett asked. Yes. Is there any ambiguity? None. Another brief stillness. Then Scarlett nodded once, the way people nodded when they were accepting something they had already decided to accept, and were done sitting with it. The drawings, she said. She was looking at Daniel. Your daughter's drawings. Vera mentioned them last night. I'd like to understand how they fit. Daniel reached into his bag and produced Emma's sketch pad. She'd given it to him that morning with the ceremony of someone transferring a significant object. He'd handled it carefully. He opened it to the relevant pages and laid it on the table. Scarlett looked at the drawings without picking them up. She looked at them for a long time. How old is she? She asked. 7. She looked at the drawing of the figure at the head of the table, the high forehead, the squared shoulders, the slight lift of the chin. Then she looked at the figure coming through the side door with the key. She drew these the night she was in the building? Scarlett asked. That night and the next day, from memory. Scarlett sat back. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at the table. A 7-year-old's drawing isn't evidentiary on its own, she said. No, but cross-referenced with the building access logs from that night, it places specific individuals in a restricted conference room during a meeting that appears in no official calendar. He paused. The drawing of the figure with the key, I ran that against the access logs for the side corridor entrance. 2 people used that entrance that night. One of them was Martin Reeves. Scarlett looked at the drawing again. Something in her expression was difficult to read. Not quite grief, not quite anger. Something that lived between them. She drew this from memory, Scarlett said. Not a question. Yes. A long pause. She must be remarkable. She is, Daniel said. She also doesn't fully know what she saw. I'd like to keep it that way as long as possible. Scarlett looked at him. Then she nodded. Understood. Martin Reeves arrived at 9:17, which was 7 minutes late. A small power gesture, Daniel suspected. the kind of subtle dominance performance that men in his position made unconsciously after years of being the most important person in every room they entered. He came through the conference room door with the ease of someone who had walked into thousands of meetings and found them organized around his presence. He was in his early 50s, well-dressed, the gray at his temples, the kind that photographed as distinguished. He had a quality of settled authority that was entirely convincing, which was presumably the quality that had made him effective at what he'd done for as long as he'd done it. He stopped when he saw Daniel. It was a small stop, barely a hesitation, but Daniel was watching for it, and it was there. Then Reeves looked at Scarlett, and his expression made a small, practiced recalibration. "Scarlett, I wasn't aware this was—" "Sit down, Martin," Scarlett said. He sat. He didn't look at Daniel again. He put his hands on the table in a posture of relaxed attentiveness that, to anyone not looking carefully, appeared completely natural. On the wall screen, 5 small rectangles lit up, board members joining from separate locations. One of them, Daniel knew from the company website, was the chair of the audit committee. Reeves looked at the board members on screen. His relaxed posture held, but something around the eyes didn't quite match it anymore. "What is this, Scarlett?" "This is the conversation we should have had a long time ago," she said, "except that the person who should have brought it to me was the person making sure it never reached me." A beat of silence that felt like a specific kind of weight. "I don't know what you mean," Reeves said. Vera placed a printed document on the table in front of him. He looked at it without touching it. Then he looked at Scarlett, and his expression did something more complicated, something that tried to be confused and arrived at something closer to calculating. "These are financial records," he said. "They are," Vera said. "Specifically, they are 18 months of transaction logs from the company's financial management system, cross-referenced with physical access records for the 39th floor data center, cross-referenced with building entry logs, and cross-referenced with a separate camera system in the data center corridor that has been recording continuously for 3 years. Reeves looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "I'd like to have my attorney present." "That's your right," Vera said. "The meeting will pause for that purpose if you'd like to make that call. I want to be clear about what this meeting is. It is an internal disclosure proceeding. Law enforcement has not yet been contacted. That decision will be made by the board and Miss Monroe following this meeting, based in part on the outcome of this conversation." Translation: if he cooperated, that fact would be noted. If he didn't, it would be noted differently. Reeves looked at Scarlett. She looked back at him without flinching. Without the old warmth, without the long history of shared work and shared stakes, just directly, the way you looked at a problem you were solving. He looked down at the document. "I want to understand," Scarlett said, and her voice was even and quiet and completely controlled. "How long?" "Not what the records say. I want to hear it from you." Reeves was quiet for a long time. 5 years, he said. The board members on screen were silent. Vera's pen didn't move. Daniel sat very still. Scarlett's expression didn't change. Only her hands, flat on the table in front of her, shifted slightly, one finger pressing down once against the surface and releasing. That was all. "From the beginning," she said. Not a question. "Not from the beginning. From the Series B round." He paused. "When it became clear how large this was going to get." "When it became clear," she said slowly, "how much there was to take." He didn't answer that. "Who else?" she asked. He hesitated. Vera placed a second document on the table, the photographs from the security logs, Emma's drawings beside them on the same page, the access records below. Reeves looked at it. His eyes stopped on Emma's drawings, the simplified, exact figures, the detail of the side door, the key. "Where did these come from, Sat?" he asked. "A 7-year-old who was in the building the night of your November meeting," Vera said. "She has a very good memory." Something moved across Reeves's face that was harder to read than anything else he'd shown in the room. Not quite fear. Something more like the specific disorientation of a careful person encountering the variable they didn't account for. He looked back at the documents. He named 2 names. One of them Daniel had identified from the access logs. The other was someone he hadn't, a name that produced a reaction around the table, a brief exchange of looks between board members on screen, a stillness from Scarlett that was different from her previous stillness. A board member. Someone who had been on the board for 4 years. He provided cover, Reeves said, whenever the audit committee got too close. He could see the committee's agenda in advance, and he stopped. He looked at the table. He managed the angle. Scarlett stood up. She walked to the window. The same window she'd stood at yesterday afternoon, the city below doing what it always did regardless of what happened inside buildings. She stood there for a moment with her back to the room. Daniel watched her. He thought about what it was like to find out that the architecture of your trust had been hollowed out, not once, but systematically, over years, by the people you'd built it with. He didn't have an adequate frame for it. The scale was too different from anything in his own experience. But the feeling underneath it, the specific loneliness of discovering you'd been wrong about someone in a way that rewrote years of history, that he understood. That was a human-sized feeling regardless of how many zeros were attached to the damage. She turned back around. Are there others? No, Reeves said. Are you certain? Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the board members on screen. I'd like a brief recess. 10 minutes. In the corridor outside the conference room, Daniel stood against the wall while Vera made a call in a low, precise voice at the far end of the hallway. Claire brought him a water he hadn't asked for. He drank it. Scarlett came out of the conference room 2 minutes into the recess and stood near him, not right beside him, a few feet away, both of them looking at the corridor wall, the framed company milestones displayed at intervals. First product launch. First 100 employees. IPO day. He didn't say anything. Neither did she for a moment. 5 years, she said quietly. Not to him specifically, to the fact of it. I'm sorry, he said. It was the true thing and also the inadequate thing, but it was what he had. She looked at one of the framed photographs, the IPO day photo, Scarlett and Reeves on a trading floor, both of them young and exhausted and grinning, confetti in the air. She looked at it without the expression of someone who was going to cry, more like the expression of someone amputating something that had to be amputated and doing it cleanly. My attorney general contact gets a call in 20 minutes, she said. After that, it's not in my hands. She paused. The board member will be a separate process. His counsel will be involved from the start, and it'll move more slowly, but it'll move. She turned slightly toward Daniel. Your evidence is the foundation of all of it. Without the financial cross-reference, without the access log timeline, we'd have had the camera footage and potentially nothing actionable behind it. He nodded. I also want to say something directly, she said, and there was a quality in her voice that was different from the meeting room voice. Not softer exactly, but less managed, more actual. The way this was handled, what they did to your files, your credentials, the review they were building against you, that happened on my watch, in my building, because my structure was being used against you, and I didn't see it. You didn't know, he said. That's not the same as it not being my responsibility. She said it without self-flagellation, just as a plain statement of fact. I wanted to say that. He thought about the right response and didn't find one, so he didn't manufacture one. Okay, he said. She almost smiled. Not quite. You're very direct. You mentioned that yesterday. I'm noting it again. She looked at the IPO photo one more time. Then she turned away from it, toward the conference room door. Let's finish this. The formal part of the meeting lasted another 50 minutes. Reeves's attorney was patched in by phone. Documents were signed. Positions were formally suspended. The language was careful and legal and had the bloodless precision of something that had been drafted in advance for exactly this contingency. Daniel answered questions from the board's audit committee chair for 15 minutes. The evidence chain, the methodology, the external backups, the scope of his original authorization versus the steps he'd taken beyond it. He was honest about all of it, including the communications metadata. The committee chair, a woman named Patricia Ng, who had the bearing of someone who had been in corporate governance long enough to be unsurprisable, asked him 3 follow-up questions and then said, "The evidence you gathered, taken as a whole, is more than sufficient. The methodology question is a matter for civil litigation, not for this board." At 11:45 it was over. The screen rectangles went dark one by one. Reeves was walked out by two people Daniel didn't recognize, legal, he assumed, or security, and the conference room was suddenly much quieter than it had been. Daniel sat at the table for a moment, not moving, feeling the specific flatness that follows sustained tension when it finally releases. Not satisfaction, just the absence of the sustained forward pressure of the past 2 weeks. Like putting down something heavy you'd been carrying so long you'd stopped feeling the weight. Vera was already packing her legal pads. She paused. "Good work," she said. 2 words stated plainly from a woman who did not appear to say things she didn't mean. "Thank you," he said. Claire appeared at the door. "Miss Monroe would like to see you in her office, when you're ready." Scarlett's actual office was larger than the conference room and considerably less formal than he'd expected. There were books on the shelves, real ones, not decorative ones, the kind with broken spines and post-its at various intervals. A standing desk pushed against the east wall with 3 monitors and a keyboard covered in sticky notes. A couch along one wall that had the slightly compressed cushions of a couch that had been actually sat on. A child's drawing, not Emma's, one she must have received from somewhere, tacked crookedly to a corkboard near the window. She was standing at the standing desk when he came in. She turned. "Sit anywhere," she said, which was a different instruction from the conference room's appointed seating. He sat on the couch. She stayed standing, which he'd noticed was her default. She seemed to think better upright. "I'm going to make you an offer," she said, without preamble. "You can decline it. There's no pressure attached." "Okay. I want to build a cybersecurity and internal audit function that reports directly to my office, not through the CFO structure, directly to me. It should have been built 3 years ago, and the fact that it wasn't was one of several structural vulnerabilities that made what happened possible." She paused. "I want you to lead it." He didn't answer immediately. He thought about it. "I'm a contractor," he said. "You'd be a direct hire. Permanent position, not contract. I don't have a traditional cybersecurity background. My experience is infrastructure and systems analysis. I know what your experience is. That's why I'm asking you." She looked at him steadily. "What you did here wasn't just technical. You understood the whole picture, the organizational dynamics, the patterns of concealment, not just the data. That's rarer than the technical skill." He was quiet for a moment. He thought about Emma, about Mrs. Carver and $40 a week, and not being able to make rent in October without moving money around in ways that felt like robbing one wall to pay another. He thought about 5 contract endings in 3 years. He thought about what it meant to have something that wasn't over after 12 weeks. "I need to understand the scope," he said, "and I'd want to talk to legal about whistleblower protections, formal ones, in the employment agreement, not because I don't trust this conversation, but because institutional trust needs to be structural." Scarlett looked at him. Something in her expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration, as if she'd expected something different and was adjusting to what she'd gotten instead. "That's an entirely reasonable requirement," she said. "Okay," he said. "Then yes, provisionally, pending the agreement language." She nodded. "Vera will be in touch by Monday." She paused. "There's one other thing." He waited. "Your daughter's drawings." She said it carefully. "They'll be entered as supporting documentation in the legal proceedings. Her name won't appear in any public filing. Vera will structure it as anonymous witness documentation, minor child. She won't be called or identified." A brief pause. "But I wanted you to know that what she contributed, the specificity of it, the detail, it mattered. It filled a gap we didn't know we needed to fill." Daniel thought about Emma at the kitchen table the night before, doing multiplication she found tedious, handing over her sketch pad with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who understood that sometimes you drew what you saw and then you let other people use it. "I'll tell her," he said, "in terms she can understand." "What will you tell her?" He thought about it. That she helped fix something that was broken. That her drawings did what drawings are supposed to do. Scarlett looked at him for a moment with an expression he was starting to recognize, not the CEO expression, not the managed attention expression from the atrium. The actual one. The one that lived underneath the surface she kept carefully maintained. "That's a good way to put it," she said. He left the building at 12:31, walked out into the Chicago cold, pulled his collar up, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching the city do what the city did. People walking fast, a cab sliding past, the river somewhere nearby, moving south toward the lake. He had to call Mrs. Carver. He was going to be home for dinner, actually home, not late, not sorry, just home. And he was going to make Emma's favorite meal, which was pasta, with the specific jarred sauce she liked, that he pretended to find embarrassing and she knew he didn't. He pulled out his phone. He called Mrs. Carver. He said he'd be home by 5. Miss Carver said Emma had been asking all day whether her drawings were being useful. "Tell her yes," Daniel said, and he meant it in more ways than he could easily explain. Tell her they were exactly what was needed. He put his phone in his pocket and started walking toward the train. Behind him, the Monroe Technologies building caught the November light the way Emma had described it, the shiniest building she had ever seen. He didn't look back at it. He didn't need to. The pasta was overcooked. Daniel had been distracted, standing at the stove, replaying fragments of the day, and he'd left it 2 minutes longer than it needed, and Emma had eaten it without complaint, but had given him a look that communicated clearly and without cruelty that she noticed. She didn't say anything. She ate her overcooked pasta and drank her water and told him about a disagreement she'd had at school with a boy named Marcus, who had insisted that a drawing could only count as art if it was made with real paint. "What did you tell him?" Daniel asked. "I told him that was a very limited definition," she said. He laughed, genuinely not the tired approximation of a laugh he'd been producing for the past 2 weeks. It came up from somewhere real, and Emma looked mildly pleased with herself. And they finished dinner with the specific quiet comfort of two people who had been through something and come out the other side of it, and were now just eating pasta in a kitchen in Chicago. He told her, after dinner, while she was drawing at the table, that her drawings had been used, that they'd helped fix something important. He chose the words carefully. Nothing that would burden her with the weight of adult stakes, nothing that would make her feel surveilled or used without consent, because she had consented and the distinction mattered. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, still looking at her current drawing. Something new, nothing to do with any of it, just a bird she'd seen outside the school window. "Good," she said. "That's all you've got?" She looked up. "What else is there? It worked? That's good." She went back to her bird. "Did the lady believe you, the important lady?" "She did." "Did it take long for her to believe you?" He thought about the atrium, the folded report, Scarlett Monroe taking it herself instead of letting Claire take it. "Not as long as I expected." Emma nodded, as if this confirmed something. "She seemed smart," she said. He looked at his daughter. "You saw her for maybe 4 seconds." "I saw her picture in the elevator directory thing. She looked like someone who paid attention." She shrugged. "People who pay attention usually figure things out eventually. They just need the right information." Daniel sat with that for a moment. A 7-year-old's theory of epistemology stated between pencil strokes while drawing a bird. "You're something else, Em," he said. She didn't look up. "You say that a lot." "It keeps being true." The weeks that followed were not clean or simple, because nothing involving criminal proceedings and corporate restructuring and a board member's quiet legal dismantling was ever clean or simple. But they moved, and moving was what mattered. Martin Reeves was formally charged 6 weeks after the conference room meeting. The charges were federal, wire fraud, securities fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and they were substantial enough that his attorney advised him in the end to cooperate with prosecutors rather than fight. The cooperation produced a plea agreement that was still being finalized 3 months later, but its outlines were clear enough. Reeves would do time, and the company would recover a significant portion of the stolen funds through asset seizure. The board member, his name was Gerald Fitch, 61 years old, 4 years on the Monroe Technologies board, and the kind of person whose respectability had been, apparently, the primary return he'd offered anyone, was a slower process, as Scarlett had said it would be. His attorney was aggressive and creative, and bought him 4 additional months of delay before the evidence, Much of it originating from Daniel's original financial analysis made the delay pointless. He resigned from the board in January. The civil case was pending. Daniel's employment agreement was signed on a Monday in December, with Vera Halston across the table and Scarlett on the phone from a flight to San Francisco. The whistleblower protections were structural, explicit, and monitored by an outside compliance firm. The scope of the cybersecurity division was broader than he'd expected. Scarlett had been thinking about the architecture of it for weeks, apparently, in the gaps between everything else she'd been managing. I want it to be genuinely independent, she'd told him in one of 3 working calls they'd had while the agreement was being drafted. Not just on paper. The reporting structure, the budget autonomy, the access, all of it needs to be built so that what happened can't happen again, even if someone tries to rebuild the same kind of influence from scratch. That's possible, he said. It requires some structural decisions that won't be popular with certain people. I know. Make the decisions. He was starting to understand that this was how she operated. She asked for your genuine assessment, absorbed it, and then gave you the authority to act on it. It was disorienting after years of contract environments where the ask was always implicitly tell me what I already want to hear. He hired 3 people in the first 2 months, all of them from outside the company's existing network, all of them vetted through a process Daniel designed from scratch. One of them, a woman named Keisha, who had spent 6 years doing forensic accounting for a federal oversight agency, told him in her second week that the financial architecture she was reviewing reminded her of 3 other cases she'd worked on. Reeves was good, she said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a professional assessment. He had years to refine it, Daniel said. Yeah, well. She turned back to her screen. He also got caught by a contractor on week 2. Daniel didn't say anything to that. He went back to his own work. Emma met Scarlett Monroe for the first time in February, which was 3 months after the conference room meeting and 7 weeks after Daniel had started his permanent role. It was not planned, which was probably why it went the way it did. He'd brought Emma to the building on a Saturday. He sometimes did that on weekends, when he needed to finish something and Mrs. Carver wasn't available and the work wasn't sensitive enough to require complete isolation. Emma was accustomed to the 14th floor by then, had a preferred chair and a preferred corner and a relationship with the weekend security guard named Phil, who had, over several Saturdays, become genuinely interested in her ongoing sketchpad project documenting interesting buildings in Chicago. Scarlett was in the building on that particular Saturday because she was almost always in the building on Saturdays, a fact that Daniel had come to understand was not workaholism exactly, but something more complicated. The building was, in some way, he hadn't fully parsed, more manageable for her than whatever waited outside it. She found them on the 14th floor by accident. She'd come down to pull a physical file from a cabinet that hadn't yet been digitized. This happened more than it should. The digitization project was 18 months behind schedule. It was on Daniel's list, and she turned the corner and found Emma in her preferred corner chair with her sketchpad, drawing something with deep concentration. Emma looked up. She looked at Scarlett. She looked back at her drawing, then back at Scarlett. "You're the important lady," Emma said. Scarlett stopped. She looked at Emma with an expression Daniel would have paid money to fully read. "I've been called that before," she said. "Is it accurate?" Emma considered this seriously. "You're important to the building. Whether you're important in general depends on what you do." A pause. "My dad says you're trying to fix things." "I'm trying," Scarlett said. "That's the right answer," Emma said, apparently satisfied, and went back to her drawing. Scarlett looked at Daniel over Emma's head with an expression that had something unguarded in it, something that might have been the closest she came to being caught off balance. "She passed the test," Daniel said quietly. "What was the test?" "She asked if you were trying. The answer, 'I'm trying,' is better than 'yes, I'm important,' or 'yes, I'm fixing things.' She doesn't like certainty about things that are hard." Scarlett looked at Emma. Emma was drawing, fully absorbed, humming something tuneless. "She's very much her own person," Scarlett said. "She always has been." Scarlett sat down, not at a desk, just in one of the open chairs nearby, with the ease of someone who'd made a decision to be somewhere and had stopped managing it. She had a coffee she'd apparently been carrying since before she found them. She looked at Emma's drawing from a few feet away. What is it? She asked Emma. The Wrigley Building, Emma said, without looking up. Bill says it's the best building in Chicago. I'm trying to get the top part right. It's harder than it looks. Can I see when you're done? Emma glanced up briefly. You can see now if you want. It's not done, but you can look. Scarlett leaned forward and looked at the sketch pad. Daniel watched her face, that focused reading quality, the same one she brought to data and people and rooms. She looked at the drawing for a genuine, unhurried moment. You got the top part right, she said. Emma looked at it critically. The proportions are still off a little. The proportions are fine. The feeling is right, which is harder. Emma looked at her. Are you an artist? No, but I know what it looks like when something captures the feeling of the real thing instead of just the surface. She sat back. Your drawings of the people in the conference room, the ones your father brought to me, they had that too. Emma's pencil paused. She glanced at Daniel briefly, then back at Scarlett. They helped? They helped a lot, Scarlett said. Thank you. Emma looked at her drawing. Her expression did a small, complex thing, a flicker of something that might have been pride and was trying not to be too visible. That's okay, she said. She paused. I didn't know what those people were doing. I just knew it was a secret meeting, and secrets in buildings make my dad worried, so I paid attention. Something moved across Scarlett's face. She looked at Daniel. He looked back at her and felt, without quite meaning to, the specific openness of a moment that hadn't been constructed or managed, just a February Saturday, bad lighting, a half-digitized filing system, and his daughter drawing the Wrigley Building while the CEO of a billion-dollar company sat nearby and drank cold coffee and looked like, for the first time in a while, she wasn't measuring the distance between herself and the room she was in. The thing about trust, the real kind, not the performed kind or the professionally necessary kind, is that it doesn't arrive. It accumulates. It's made of small decisions, most of them unremarkable, that add up to something you can only see clearly when you look back at them from a distance. Daniel and Scarlett built something in the months that followed. He would have been hard-pressed at any given point to define exactly what it was, because it didn't fit neatly into any category that felt accurate. It wasn't a workplace relationship, though it lived partly in the workplace. It wasn't a friendship, though it had some of a friendship's characteristics. The ease of conversation, the specific comfort of someone who said what they meant, the way they disagreed without it becoming a performance. It was something more ungainly and honest than either of those things, built out of the specific circumstances that had brought them into each other's orbit. A fraud investigation, a 15-page report handed over in a crowded atrium, a conference room on the 40th floor where she'd had to turn toward a window to do the work of accepting something that changed the shape of the last 5 years. They had a standing Tuesday afternoon check-in, ostensibly about the cybersecurity division's progress reports, that had a way of running 40 minutes over schedule because the conversation kept moving into territory that wasn't strictly divisional. She would ask his opinion on things outside his technical scope. He gave it honestly, which she appeared to value specifically because he didn't soften it into what she might want to hear. She pushed back sometimes. He held his ground when he thought he was right, and revised when he thought she was more right. And the distinction between those two things was something they'd worked out without discussing it. He was not a billionaire CEO. She was not a single father living in a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where parking was always a problem. The distance between their lives was real, and they both knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise, which was, paradoxically, one of the things that made the thing they were building feel solid rather than constructed. Emma remained the most honest element in all of it. Children generally are. They don't have the social architecture to manage other people's comfort, and Emma had always been particularly unmanaged in that way. She liked Scarlett. She said so plainly when Daniel asked, because Scarlett talked to her like she was a person rather than a child-shaped thing that needed to be handled carefully. A lot of adults do that, Emma said once, doing homework at the kitchen table while Daniel made dinner. Talk to me like I might break. Do I do that? He asked. She considered it. Sometimes, when you're worried. A pause. You've been less worried lately. He turned from the stove to look at her. Have I? Yes. She didn't elaborate, just went back to her homework. But there was something in the observation. the quiet, steady noticing of someone who had been watching her father's emotional weather for years, that settled into him in a particular way. He had been less worried, not because the circumstances of his life had become uncomplicated. They hadn't. Money was still close to the bone in ways that the new salary would take months to fully alleviate. And single parenthood had a specific daily weight that didn't lift regardless of professional circumstances. But something had changed in the basic register of it. He'd been carrying a particular kind of defensive tension for years, the braced posture of someone who expects the floor to shift, and somewhere between the conference room in February and the standing Tuesday check-ins, some of that had eased. He wasn't sure when. That was probably how it was supposed to work. In March, the Monroe Technologies Board voted unanimously to formalize a restructured governance framework that Daniel had helped design over the previous 2 months. The framework created independent audit oversight, rotating external financial review, and a direct reporting line from cybersecurity and compliance to the CEO that bypassed the CFO structure entirely. It also created, for the first time in the company's history, an anonymous internal reporting channel with genuine legal protections. The board vote happened on a Tuesday. Scarlett texted him afterward, not a call, just a text, which was how she communicated things she was processing rather than reporting. It passed. All 5 remaining members. He was in a meeting when it came in. He read it under the table, which he normally considered rude, and typed back, "Good. How do you feel?" A longer pause than usual. Like we fixed a structural problem. Not like I'm done. He thought about that for a moment, then typed, "You're not done, but you fixed the structural problem. Those are both true at the same time." The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, "When did you get so reasonable?" He put his phone away and went back to the meeting. The evening that stayed with him, the one that he would return to later, when he tried to understand the arc of the year and where it had turned, was in late April. Emma had a school art show. An end-of-semester event in the school gym, children's work taped to folding display panels, parents circling with cups of mediocre coffee, and the specifically strained enthusiasm of adults trying to honor something that mattered to their children. Emma had 3 pieces in the show, 2 drawings and a watercolor she'd done in class that she claimed was unfinished, but her teacher had submitted anyway, a decision Emma had strong feelings about. Daniel had mentioned the art show to Scarlett in passing, not as an invitation, just in the natural course of conversation, explaining why he'd be unavailable Thursday evening. Scarlett had asked a few questions about it in the way she asked questions about Emma, which was with genuine attention rather than the social performance of adult interest in a colleague's child. He hadn't expected her to come. She appeared at the gym door at 6:45 in a coat that was wrong for an elementary school gymnasium, with the particular look of someone who has made a decision and is now managing the uncertainty of what they'll find on the other side of it. She spotted Daniel across the gym and made her way over with the focused navigation of someone who was not entirely comfortable in this kind of social space. The informal gathering, the ambient noise, the no-agenda milling, and was compensating by moving purposefully. "I hope this isn't strange," she said when she reached him. "It's not," he said. And it wasn't, which was its own kind of interesting. Emma found them 2 minutes later. She looked at Scarlett, looked at her father, looked back at Scarlett with the measuring quality she brought to situations she was assessing. "You came to my art show," she said. "Your father mentioned it. I hope that's okay." Emma considered. "Did you come because of my dad or because of the art show?" "Both," Scarlett said, "but I wouldn't have known about the art show without your dad." Emma seemed to find this an acceptable answer. "The watercolor is unfinished," she said immediately. "I want you to know that before you see it. My teacher submitted it anyway. I think it looks like someone sneezed on blue paper." Scarlett kept her expression serious. "I'll take that into account." Emma led them around the display panels with the authority of someone conducting a curated tour, explaining each piece with specific, unsentimental commentary, pointing out what she'd been trying to do versus what had actually happened on the paper, making critical observations about her own work that were considerably more accurate than most of the parental commentary floating around them. When they reached the watercolor, Scarlett stood in front of it for a long moment. It was a cityscape, The Chicago skyline, roughly rendered in blues and grays, the buildings bleeding into each other in the way that wet watercolor did when you hadn't controlled the water properly. "The bleeding is actually good," Scarlett said. "It looks like the city in fog. Like early morning." Emma looked at it, looked at Scarlett. "I didn't do that on purpose." "I know, some of the best things aren't on purpose." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said with the careful honesty she applied to things she wasn't sure about, "I think I like it better now than I did." Scarlett looked at her. "That's how it works sometimes. You need someone else to show you what you already made." Emma seemed to absorb this. She looked at the watercolor again, then at Scarlett with the expression she used when she was filing something away as genuinely useful. "Okay," she said. Daniel stood slightly back from both of them, holding his mediocre coffee, watching his daughter and this woman look at a watercolor together in a school gymnasium in Chicago. And he felt, with some discomfort, because he was not naturally a person who allowed himself to feel things without first determining whether feeling them was wise, that something in this scene was exactly the shape of something he hadn't known he'd been missing. He didn't name it that night. He wasn't ready to name it, but he didn't look away from it either, which was, for him, a form of progress. It was Scarlett who named it first, in the way that people who are not naturally expressors of feeling sometimes name things, sideways, in motion, not looking directly at it. It was a Tuesday in May, after a check-in that had run over by an hour because they'd been arguing about the timeline for the compliance framework rollout, and they were standing at the elevator bank waiting for the car to arrive, both of them a little tired. The argument resolved into something that wasn't agreement but was workable. "Can I ask you something that isn't about work?" she said. He looked at her. "Yes." "Do you like being around me?" "Not professionally, in general." He took a moment with the question, not because he didn't know the answer, but because it deserved an honest one rather than a reflexive one. "Yes," he said, "I find you're one of the few people I've spent time with in the last couple of years who I don't feel like I have to manage my words around." She looked at the elevator doors. "I find that easier with you too, which is not my default." "I know." "I'm not good at this," she said, and he understood that this was not a vague reference. It was specific. "I've spent most of my adult life building a structure specifically so that people couldn't get close enough to damage things. And then the one time that structure was actually supposed to protect me, it was being run by the person I'd trusted the most to maintain it." He didn't fill the silence. He let it be what it was. "I'm trying to figure out how to trust people again in a way that isn't naive," she said. "And it's uncomfortable, because the honest answer is that you can't ever be certain. There's no architecture that completely eliminates the risk." She paused. "You just have to decide that some people are worth the uncertainty." The elevator arrived. Neither of them moved toward it. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "Is that all you've got?" "I also know that you already decided," he said. "About me, specifically. You took the report from the atrium. You could have let Claire take it and had it reviewed through proper channels. You didn't." She was quiet for a moment. "That's true. So you've been operating on that decision for 6 months. It just took you until now to say it out loud." She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts exasperated and something much warmer, and she said, "You're genuinely irritating sometimes. You've mentioned that." "I'm mentioning it again." The elevator doors opened a second time. This time they got in. They rode down in a comfortable silence that had a different quality from the functional silences of work. Something easier in it, something that didn't need to be filled. In the lobby, she stopped before the exit. "Emma's school lets out at 3 on Fridays," she said. "Yes." Would she want to get food somewhere, the three of us? He looked at Scarlett Monroe, 30 years old, one of the most powerful people in a city full of powerful people, standing in her own lobby in a coat that had been wrong for an elementary school gymnasium, asking with a degree of visible uncertainty that she probably didn't show to many people whether a 7-year-old would want to get food. "She'd want input on where," he said, a ghost of a smile. "Obviously." "Then yes, she would." Chad. Emma chose a diner on the north side that she'd been lobbying Daniel to visit for 2 months. It had a counter with spinning stools and a menu that was 4 pages long and a slice of lemon meringue pie in a rotating glass case that Emma had seen through the window on a previous pass and had been thinking about since. She ordered the pie before her main course, which the waitress allowed with the ease of someone who had seen this maneuver before, and she ate it with methodical satisfaction while Scarlett watched with an expression that was unguarded in a way Daniel hadn't seen from her in a public setting. The conversation moved the way it moved when Emma was part of it, unpredictably, with sudden detours into topics that adults wouldn't have thought to raise, and then back to something that turned out to be connected in a way you hadn't anticipated. She asked Scarlett about the shiniest building she'd ever seen other than her own. She asked what it was like to be in charge of so many people. She asked, with complete guilelessness, whether Scarlett had a family. Not in the traditional sense, Scarlett said. She held Emma's gaze. I have people I care about. It's a smaller group than most. Emma considered this. Quality over quantity, she said. Exactly. Emma ate a bite of pie. My dad's like that too, she said. He doesn't have a lot of friends, but the ones he has are good ones. And he has me. She looked at Daniel. And Mrs. Carver, kind of. Mrs. Carver counts, Daniel said. Mrs. Carver definitely counts. Emma turned back to Scarlett. You should get a Mrs. Carver, someone who smells like cinnamon. Scarlett looked at Emma for a moment with an expression that was doing several things at once. I'll keep that in mind, she said. Emma appeared satisfied. She went back to her pie. The diner hummed around them, other people's conversations, the counter stools spinning when someone sat down or stood up, the waitress moving between tables with the specific efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 20 years and had found a rhythm in it. Daniel looked at the two of them across the table. Emma with her pie and her comfortable certainty about how the world should be organized. Scarlett with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, her posture slightly less maintained than usual. Her attention on Emma with the quality of someone who had been surprised by what was possible in an ordinary room. He thought about what it took to get here. The 2 weeks of being systematically dismantled, the deleted files and the credential resets and the competency review that never happened, the early morning cross-references and the atrium approach, and the conference room on the 40th floor. He thought about all the moments where it could have gone differently, where he could have been less stubborn, or less certain that the pattern he was seeing was real, or less willing to hand 15 pages to a woman who had every structural reason to dismiss them. He thought about Emma, locked box, sketchpad. I drew what I saw. That's what you're supposed to do. He thought about trust, how you couldn't build it without risk, and the risk never fully went away. And the people who waited until they were certain before extending it generally waited forever. You had to choose at some point to believe that what you were looking at was real. And then you had to act on that belief before you had proof. That was the whole thing. That was all of it. He had chosen. Emma, in her way, had chosen. Scarlett had chosen in an atrium without ceremony. None of them had been certain. That was fine. Certainty was overrated and mostly unavailable, and people who needed it before moving had the wrong idea about how things worked. Martin Reeves was sentenced in June. 11 years federal. The sentencing coverage was brief and factual. Daniel read the article once, early in the morning before Emma was awake, and then closed his laptop and made breakfast. Gerald Fitch settled the civil case in July. The terms were not disclosed, but Vera Halston called Daniel the afternoon the settlement was finalized and said, in her precise 2-word way, it's sufficient. The company had its best quarter in its history in Q2. Not because of anything dramatic, no new product, no acquisition, no strategic masterstroke. Just the measurable effect of removing a structural rot that had been draining resources for 5 years and replacing it with governance that actually functioned. The board chair, Patricia Eng, sent Scarlett a note that Daniel heard about secondhand, which said, in part, that the culture shift was palpable in every interaction she'd had with the company's leadership over the previous 2 quarters. Scarlett read it to him once, at the end of a Tuesday check-in. Palpable culture shift, he said. Do you accept that assessment? She thought about it. Partially. The culture shift is real, but I don't think it comes from governance structure primarily. She looked at him. I think it comes from people deciding what they're willing to tolerate. Once that decision changes, everything downstream changes with it. That's a little philosophical for a quarterly report. I'm allowed to be philosophical. It's my company. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The late afternoon light through the 40th floor windows was doing something specific to the room, the kind of light that only happened in Chicago in early summer when the angle was right. "You've changed too," he said. She didn't deflect it. "I know, I'm less certain than I used to be, which sounds like a loss, but doesn't feel like one." She paused. "I used to think certainty was what made me effective. Turns out it was mostly what kept me from seeing things clearly." "What changed that?" She looked at him with the expression he'd come to know as the actual one. "You handed me 15 pages in an atrium and weren't certain of anything except that the data was real. That was it. You were scared, I think, and you did it anyway, and it turned out the willingness to act without certainty was more useful than any amount of being certain." He was quiet for a moment. "I was scared," he confirmed. "I know. It was obvious. You didn't say anything. It didn't matter." She looked at the window. Fear and courage occupy the same moment. You don't get one without the other. The question is just which one you act from. Outside, Chicago moved through its summer afternoon. The river, the lake, somewhere to the east, the steady northward crawl of traffic on Michigan Avenue. The city that didn't ease you into anything but that rewarded, in its way, the people who kept moving through it regardless. On a Friday evening in August, they stood together on the terrace of a restaurant 41 stories up, looking out over the city in the last light of a summer day. Emma was with Mrs. Carver, who had been told only that Daniel had a work dinner, which was not entirely a lie. Scarlett was a work person and also a dinner person, and the two categories had stopped being cleanly separate some months ago. The city below them was doing what cities did in the last hour of summer daylight, moving differently than it moved at noon, slower and warmer, the light coming sideways and turning everything it touched a specific gold that Chicago only produced in the late summer evenings. Neither of them spoke for a moment. This was something they'd gotten comfortable with. The inhabited silences, the ones that didn't need filling. Some people never got there. Some relationships spent their entire existence managing the silence with noise. He and Scarlett had gotten there relatively fast, which he thought said something about both of them, though he wasn't certain what. "Emma told me something last week," Scarlett said. He looked at her. "Should I be worried?" She said, a small pause, something in her voice that was careful with whatever she was carrying. "She said she thought I was lonely before all of this. She said she could tell." He didn't say anything. I asked her how she could tell. Scarlett looked out at the city. She said lonely people look at rooms the way you look at something you're not sure you're allowed to be in. A long moment of quiet. "She's 7, Daniel said. "She's 7, and she's right." Scarlett turned slightly toward him. "I did look at rooms that way. I still do sometimes. It takes a long time to unlearn." "It does." "But less than it used to." She looked at him directly. "That's something you should know." He looked at Scarlett Monroe, the woman who had trusted almost nobody, who had built an empire and a wall around it and staffed the wall with people who were supposed to be loyal, and some of whom had used the position to hollow her out from the inside, who had stood in a conference room and made a choice to believe 15 pages from a contractor she didn't know, who had sat in a school gymnasium in a coat that was wrong for the occasion and told his daughter that some of the best things weren't on purpose. "I know," he said. She didn't look away. "What do you know, specifically?" "That you're different than you were in November," he said. "And that the difference is, it's good. It suits you better." He paused. The wall was impressive, but this is better. She looked at him for a long moment with the expression he'd come to understand as the truest one she had. No management, no distance, just actual. Then she looked back at the city, and something in her posture shifted, not tensing, the opposite of that. Settling. Emma also said, she continued quietly, that she thought I should stay. He looked out at the city. "She's 7, he said again. "She's 7, and she has a better read on rooms than most adults I've met." A pause. "And she's not wrong." The city held its summer light for another few minutes, the way summer light in Chicago always held a little longer than you expected, and then it began, slowly and without drama, to change into something else. The blue-gray of an August evening coming in from the lake, the first lights of the buildings coming on one by one below them. Neither of them moved. This was not a perfect moment. It was not a clean or certain one. It was two imperfect people standing on a terrace in a city that didn't ease you into anything, having arrived here through a fraud investigation and 15 pages and a 7-year-old's drawings and a series of small, unremarkable choices that had accumulated into something neither of them had planned. But it was real. That was the whole thing. That was enough. Whatever came next, the ongoing proceedings, the compliance framework, the Tuesday check-ins that ran over, the dinners at diners with spinning stools, the art shows and the overcooked pasta and the negotiations over where a 7-year-old would consent to eat. It would be complicated and imperfect and sometimes difficult and sometimes very ordinary. It would also be real. And the only people who believed that wasn't enough were the ones who had never lost it. Down the street, Emma was probably still drawing the bird from outside the school window or the Wrigley building or something entirely new that she hadn't shown anyone yet. She drew what she saw, and she let the people who needed to see it, and she kept the rest in the locked box with the photograph and the glass bird and the friendship bracelet, safe and private and entirely her own. She was 7. She already understood the important things. She had probably understood them before either of the adults in her life had gotten around to it. That, if you were looking for a place to put the lesson, the one this whole tangle of events had been moving toward without announcing itself, was probably it. Pay attention. Draw what you see. Trust the people who prove they're worth it. And when you find something broken, don't look away from it just because looking is hard. The rest, eventually, follows.